Hello, this is a video on globalisation. It's part of Economics A2 level Unit 4. Globalisation is the growing integration of the world's economy, which leads to businesses producing products away from their country of origin and products being marketed on a worldwide basis. It also leads to international interdependence, so when lots of countries are all trading with each other, and that can be good because more variety, more choice tends to be more efficient, that sort of thing. But it can also lead to recession spreading all the way around the world or whatever. So the saying goes, when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. We've actually seen a rise in globalisation recently, particularly over the last few hundred years, and most of this is due to the growth of multinational companies. A multinational company is a company that has its sort of assets, its factories, that sort of thing, in a different place to the home country, sort of the country where the company was born, that sort of thing. They tend to be global companies, big brand names that you know all about. Adidas, HTC, Krispy Kreme donuts, that sort of thing. Multinational companies have grown for quite a few reasons that are written on the screen there on the left. Part of this is due to technological change, so communications. It's a lot easier for countries and companies within countries to talk to each other and get stuff done. If they want data to travel from one country to another, that's a lot easier now. So if another country can produce cheaper, previously if there was poor technology between the countries, that would mean that there wouldn't be enough connection for a company to put its factory there. But now, because they can talk to each other, we can have a factory in another country where it's cheaper to produce. Also, transport change has led to containerization and that sort of thing, so it's reducing costs further. So if we have our factory in Guatemala, is that even a place, Guatemala? Is that a type of vegetable? Yeah, it's a country. I was thinking of guacamole. My bad. If we have our factory in Guatemala before, it would be quite hard to ship our stuff over. It'd take a long time. Whereas now we've had lots of transport changes and improvements in transport, so it's a lot faster to get stuff from place to place. Also, the growth of markets abroad, and this is for two reasons. One, because we can sell to them, so that encourages globalisation. So, say before country A had very poor growth and that sort of thing. Now the whole world's sort of growing and country A may have got a booming economy, so now we can actually sell to them. Also, if markets abroad are growing, their production costs are probably falling, so there's more FDI, more interdependence essentially. And finally, a reduction in protectionism, partially down to the World Trade Organization. We'll look at that later. So what has globalisation led to? Well, it's actually led to foreign competition entering previously domestic markets, and that can be good because it encourages efficiency because everyone wants to be producing cheaper, but it can be bad. So say Jeremy's got his coffee shop and now all these multinational companies are coming and Jeremy simply can't compete with the sort of quality that they're providing with the low prices. So poor domestic Jeremy is now a domestic unemployed Jeremy, which is sad. So that sort of thing can happen. Deindustrialisation as well, structural unemployment, because now people can trade across different countries. Countries that have got a higher sort of wage rate simply can't compete with countries with lower wage rates. So because we've got a minimum wage, we can't compete with countries that don't have it. So it's led to closing of industries, that sort of thing, which obviously is structural unemployment, and that's never good. On a happier note, we've got more economies of scale because we're able to sell to more people, so we can benefit from maybe even reaching our minimum efficient scale, that sort of thing. So it's much more efficient, which leads to lower costs and therefore lower prices. Woo! And finally, more mergers and joint ventures, because the countries sort of talking to each other and that sort of thing. This could be more efficient, but also not so good for other reasons. Often, if we have lots of larger companies, prices can go up, that sort of thing. This is more microeconomic though, so you probably don't want to mention it too much. The World Trade Organization encourages competition between countries, so essentially it reduces protectionism, which is why I've shown it knocking down the fences there. It also settles disputes between countries regarding protection, because often countries might put on protection, and other countries are like, nah, you can't do that, you can't put protection, that's against the rules. So the World Trade Organization will sort of sort that out, but it will also try to protect the consumer. So we've got the cow there, and it's due of mad cow disease. So the World Trade Organization, I think at one point it sort of allowed embargoes on beef from certain countries, simply to prevent the spread of disease, because that would be pretty bad. Multinational companies, as we've said before, originate in developed countries and typically provide foreign direct investment into developing countries, where they locate production processes and generate raw materials, so they can be quite good for the country that they go to. However, the impact can be limited or is definitely dependent on the following factors. So the willingness to accommodate the needs of the local economy, sort of employment, training, environmental protection, health and safety considerations, that sort of thing. Often an MNC might go to a less economically developed country to cut its costs, then it might think, well, I don't care about the environmental standards, so they might not actually care about the environment. So it can be great for the economy, but they might start living in a place of high pollution that can lead to all kinds of horrible diseases, which is important for the second point, really, the ability of the host country to regulate activities. So they've got to make sure that they don't forgo human rights considerations to attract FDI. So we can't say, look, we've got all these cheap workers, come hire them, if the sort of amount that the MNC is paying these workers is less than the amount they need to stay alive and comfortably alive. So it says there, even in my notes, ensure suitable minimum wage to prevent exploitation. Also make sure that all taxes are paid correctly for maximum benefit and that sort of thing. And the final one is the ability of the host country to stay competitive. So essentially MNCs, big corporations, they can move in and out of countries very quickly. So if one country is really attractive because it's competitive, they might go plonk there, and then that country suddenly loses its competitiveness, which is an issue, especially with wages, because a country that's doing well is going to start to put in minimum wages and that sort of thing. Then they might think, oh, we don't want to work here anymore, and they'll move away, and then there'll be massive unemployment. So it's really important for the host country to keep the MNC by keeping costs low. Gotta go low. I'm actually tone deaf. I don't know if I've told you this before, but I wasn't allowed to join the Anyone Can Join choir. They were like, no, we don't think this is the right place for you. That was a bit embarrassing. Though I was once in a school musical, in the choir, miming. Moving swiftly on from my failed singing career, let's look at international trade benefits for developed and developing countries. Big benefits for the developed countries, because they can use the cheap production elsewhere. They can reduce the price of the goods and stuff, so that can lead to cheap imports, which not only reduces inflationary pressure leading to a healthier economy, but also leads to higher real incomes, because people can afford to buy more with the same amount of money, so then they've got a higher standard of living. Woo! This can, I don't know why this last one's in the positives, it's really a negative. Deindustrialisation, growth of the tertiary sector, sort of thing, rather than, so we've essentially had a shift from the primary and secondary to the tertiary sector, which leads to a reduction in environmental threats. This isn't a good thing, deindustrialisation, not short term anyway, so it's sort of the one that they've shoved on there, I think. Well, I've shoved on there, I don't know why. I like the environment. There's my tree hugger, he's got a dislocated arm. Very dangerous to hug trees for too long, you can get splintered and get attacked by birds and die. That sort of thing. Anyway, benefits for developing countries. More integrated in the world economy, so domestic firms are able to sort of make their move on the international market and start to make profits, leading to increased income levels and a higher standard of living. Also, the massive amounts of trade that going on between countries leads to a foreign trade multiplier. So if people start trading with each other, they start to trade more and more, and then local people will see their incomes rise, which leads to reduced unemployment and less poverty. So it's all jolly good until you think about... I was doing sort of hand actions and I hit the microphone, my bad. It's all good until you think about the fact that there can be recessions abroad, and your jolly little country that used to be happy by itself, being what they called subsistence farmers, or whatever they're called, now it's on the international market, yay, and then a big country has a massive financial crisis, kaboom! That was deliberate. And, well, everyone gets unemployed and poverty is back to the way it was. And you might have even lost your farmland to factories. Not good. Benefits for everyone, yay! If I was really cool, I would have one of those sound bites where you've got the audience going, yeah! And they're always really annoying, they really annoy me, but I think that would fit nicely here, because benefits for everyone. Specialisation is the first one. International trade allows specialisation, which leads to greater efficiency. If you remember from Unit 3, I think there's 3 types of efficiency. There's productive, allocative and dynamic. We get productive efficiency because lots of firms are going to have to cut their costs in order to remain competitive now there's more firms in the market. Allocative efficiency because people have to modify their goods in order to boost demand, so that sort of thing. And dynamic efficiency because people want to stay ahead of the game and that sort of thing, so they have to create new products and try to allure the customers in. Lure, I like that word. Lure and allure. What does allure mean? I'm gonna look it up. Allure, the quality of being powerful and mysteriously attractive or fascinating. I tried to say that in an alluring voice and totally failed. Sorry, I'm getting quite distracted today. Minimum efficient scale. Essentially, if you remember that from Unit 3 as well, we've got lots of demand from abroad, so we need to increase our output, so we're increasing production. If you remember the diagram, we're sort of sliding rightwards along the sort of production thing, and the further along that we are, the closer we are to our minimum efficient scale, up to a point, obviously. Eventually you can get off it, and that's not good. But because that's quite hard to do in a lot of industries, hopefully we can reach our minimum efficient scale, which obviously leads to greater efficiency, lower prices, and happier consumers. Employment, overseas market, need for increased output because they're demanding stuff now, so we think, woohoo, we can produce more. So we have to employ more people to produce this extra stuff to sell to abroad, which leads to a rise in employment, economic growth, rising living standards, and everyone's very happy. I hope you appreciate my cat. I drew it because the slide looked a bit empty, and I was gonna give it hands and feet and stuff, and I thought, you know what, it doesn't need that, we can have a disabled cat. Also, I was quite lazy, but yeah, there's my pretty cat. I love cats. Absolute advantage is when a country is using a given resource input is able to produce more than another country with the same input. So say we've got two countries, A and B, they're both producing jelly beans. Country A can produce 10 jelly beans with one worker, country B can only produce 5 with one worker. So country A has got absolute advantage if it can produce more stuff with the same input. For a long time we thought absolute advantage was why everyone specialised, but then someone came up with the theory of comparative advantage. His name was I think it began with an N. Yeah, I lied, it was David Ricardo. My bad, just look that up. And there's actually a whole other video on that if you want to see it, but it's essentially when a country produces a good with a lower input cost than other countries. So essentially it's got a lower opportunity cost of producing a good than elsewhere. So more detail on that because it's quite a complicated topic, there's another video. However, here are some assumptions we have to make when we're looking at comparative advantage. We assume constant costs, perfectly mobile factors of production, we ignore problems caused by fluctuating exchange rate, we think that as being irrelevant, ignore protectionism, such as on goods of strategic value, which are goods that are important to a country because they provide the bulk of employment, that sort of thing. We ignore time period, and we ignore transportation costs. Pretty sure I go into those in a lot more detail on the other video. Fun fact, the other video, comparative advantage video, was the last video I made before I went for my Oxford interview, and during the interview they actually asked me about my YouTube channel, and they asked me what videos I'd made, and I had a whole series of questions about comparative advantage, because that was the last video I'd made, which was an interesting experience, to say the least. Didn't really know the answers to any of the questions, but still, fun times. The terms of trade, we've got a fun calculation here. TOT is equal to the index of export prices divided by the index of import prices times 100. And basically, if we have an improvement in the TOT, you can get more imports for a given number of exports. So that leads to obviously a rise in the quality of price, and because we've got cheaper imports, less inflationary pressure, that sort of thing. However, if our imports are cheaper, our exports can seem more expensive to foreigners. So if we have got an elastic demand for these goods from foreign countries, we can see a fall in demand if our goods are getting more expensive, or at least looking more expensive, which can lead to a worsening of the deficit. Things that can affect the terms of trade are inflation and changes in the exchange rate. I think we look at exchange rate in a load of detail in possibly the next video. Not the next video will be on the balance of payments. It'll be the video after that. If you haven't fallen asleep by then, that is. Obviously exchange rate affects it because it'll mess with prices either way. If we have a stronger exchange rate, imports seem cheaper, exports seem more expensive. A weaker exchange rate, imports seem more expensive, exports seem cheaper. Inflation just affects prices because it likes to do that. Obviously you can look at inflation in our country and in other countries. Now we're going to look at the Marshall-Lerner condition. Obviously Marshall is Alfred Marshall. He was one of the first people that really implemented mathematics into economics. So if you're doing econometrics and you hate it, blame him. Essentially, the condition states that the depreciation of a currency leads to an overall improvement in the current account as long as the combined PEDs, so that's price elasticity of demand, of exports and imports when they're summed together exceeds 1. Depreciation is essentially the fall in the value of a currency compared to another currency. It's particularly associated with a floating exchange rate. Come on to that at some point. And imports when they're summed together exceeds 1. Protectionism, essentially anything that reduces free trade. It's one of the most fascinating subjects, I think, because obviously there's this sort of selfish instinct. You want to protect your own country, your own sort of industries and that sort of thing. But you also want to benefit from world industry in order to, the selfish need to have a better life. So it's definitely a very interesting one to look at. Here are some arguments for and against protectionism. Infant industries are essentially industries that are less efficient because they've just started up. And we think that if we can provide protectionism, they can grow, reach their minimum efficient scale and be competitive on the international market. Without protectionism, we argue that they will simply be quashed by sort of international competitors before they've got the chance to flourish and meet their full potential. Definitely an interesting one. Domestic employment. We also think that it's very important to protect our labour, so we'd rather have more inefficient sort of production of goods and services than have a totally inefficient workforce that don't work at all, because that's so much wasted output. Prevention of dumping. Other countries may price out competition at a loss before raising prices, so it's this sort of fear that another country is going to suddenly plummet its prices because they've got maybe a bigger pot of money. They can afford to make losses for a short period of time that will wipe everyone else out, and then there'll be a sort of international monopoly almost, and they'll have massive high prices and horrible inefficiencies and that sort of thing. The final one is to prevent what we might call unfair competition. So we might say, look at that country over there. They're producing their stuff cheaply because they're exploiting their workers. And I'm not sure why we're speaking in a sort of Scottish, is it? I can't remember what the accent is. Yeah, anyway, so we think that, we say that it's for sort of the moral high ground. We want to prevent being priced out by these immoral people. Obviously, in reality, it's just we want to protect our own industries. Anyway, why is protection bad? Well, we also have horrible welfare losses. So we often have massive inefficiencies when countries aren't specialising in the good with the lowest opportunity cost of production. So I think in a couple of slides we're going to see a picture of a diagram for when we impose a tariff. That's a horrible amount of welfare loss, so that's another example of this. There's obviously the risk of retaliation. We say we're going to put a tariff on cheese, and then you say you're going to put it on Brussels sprouts, and then that other country says, well, that's not fair, we're going to put some tariffs on, and we're going to put them on turkey, and then you've not got any Christmas dinner. I don't even know why I'd have cheese at Christmas, but you might do. Reduced choice. Protection reduces imports, so it leads to less choice. Obviously, if you're having your own sort of country's produce essentially cheaper than other countries' produce, people in your country are going to almost be forced financially to choose products from within your country, so they have less choice, and you could say that leads to them having a lower value of life, or you could say it leads to them being less fussy. So you could argue that positively, but I think that's pretty pushing it. Inefficiency. Obviously you can have inefficient sort of industries and monopolies, that sort of thing, supported by protection. If you've got lots of protectionism around, you've got less competition, so we might have got this massive monopoly which is being supported by this sort of system of tariffs, and less competition, so higher prices essentially. Not good. Finally, the unfair redistribution of income. So protection essentially supports the protected, surprisingly. So those who aren't protected by this protectionism are likely to see a fall in demand for their products, therefore a fall in income, and they might be made essentially forced out of the market, I suppose. I'm trying to think of the likelihood of getting a protectionism question. I don't think you're going to get a pure for and against one because that's more AS level. So you could sort of bring it in as a theory within other theories. I doubt you're going to be given a for and against one, although I could be totally wrong and the examiners might be feeling particularly kind. We now have a beautiful rainbow of protectionism techniques, tariff subsidies, embargoes, quotas, administrative restrictions, and voluntary export restraints. I'm actually going to move you on to another slide pretty quickly for tariffs because I actually did a diagram. And I figured that plonking a diagram bang on in the slide would ruin my rainbow, and I thought my rainbow was too precious to be ruined by a tariff diagram. Tariffs, that's definitely one to look at the spelling of 1R, 2Fs. I'm only saying this because I spelt it wrong when I typed up this slide. I was looking at it, I was like, that does not look right, so I looked it up, I was like, that's wrong. Also deficit, it's DEFICIT, it's not got an E in the middle. I've done that before a lot of times. I really can't win with economics. If I spell something wrong, they're like, oh, you're an English student, you should be able to do that. If I do a calculation wrong, they're like, oh, you're a math student, a further math student, you should be able to do that. No way to win. Actually, there is a way to win, get it right. But then they're like, oh, you're a math student, that's expected. There needs to be a way to force yourself to go beyond expectations. But this is massive divergent. We're meant to be looking at the tariff diagram. I am really sorry about that. Two types of taxes. There's specific tax and ad valorem tax. A specific tax is a tax that's levied at a fixed rate per unit, so that'll be parallel, I think, to the original line, whereas ad valorem tax is a percentage of the unit price, so that will be at a sort of angle from the line, sort of going more and more outwards, if that makes sense. On this diagram you can see that the country has got sort of higher prices than the world price, so they've decided to impose their tariff, which you can see there, which is a bit higher than the world price. It's essentially a bit like imposing a minimum price, and the size of the tax is the difference between those two lines. We can see that the consumer loss is the difference between the two lines, so it's sections 1, 2 and 3. So basically that whole coloured in bit there is the amount that the consumer loses because they're spending more on the products. However, the domestic suppliers gain a bit of extra revenue, that 1 there, because they're selling at a higher price. The tariff is the tax on import, so all imported goods are going to be at this price as well, which means that consumers are equally likely to choose all the different products, so this company here, or even this sort of industry within this country, is no longer going to be priced out of the market, at least not to the same extent. Then we can look at who else gains. There's also the government who gains because they're selling at a higher price, so they're getting more taxation in from the companies that are selling at this price. So they get the bit in the middle, the number 3 is the revenue they get, taxation revenue, because it's the difference between the amount being demanded and the amount being supplied. It's that sort of little area there. So the net welfare loss is essentially the total loss minus any gains that anyone makes. So it's 1 plus 2 plus 3 minus domestic supplier gains, that's minus 1, minus government revenue, so minus 3, and we're left with those two beautiful triangles there. So this essentially shows that a tariff leads to a net welfare loss. Sad times. This diagram is definitely a really useful one to learn and to shove in there because it's relatively quick to draw. Examiner will go tick 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 as long as you explain it nicely. Good news all round, really. Talking of ticks, you don't know how proud I was when I found that black tick to tick off tariffs because we'd done them. I was really happy. Anyway, moving on to subsidies, essentially the opposite of a tariff. It's reducing the cost for the exporter. These are generally forbidden even, so we don't really look at them too much anymore. But it essentially means that, say we had an exporter that was selling at A and the world price was B, the government might provide a subsidy to reduce the cost for the exporter from A to B so they can compete better. You can sort of do a similar diagram to the one you did for tariffs, showing that this is also bad. Embargoes, I prefer to call them embargoes. That's actually totally embarrassing. Oh well. This is essentially a total ban of trade with a country or of a certain good. So elephants, for example, we might agree not to have any trade of elephants for this country with another country because we think we need to protect the elephant industry within the UK because obviously we've got such a strong elephant industry. That sort of thing. Embargoes can be quite good when you need to protect against diseases. As we said before with the beef, we said, look, no, we're not going to have any trade of beef. I think it was with France, that sort of thing. We said, no, we're not going to allow any importation of beef from that country. Obviously, embargoes tend to be a bit risky because then you get other countries saying, well, that's not fair. If you're going to ban imports from us, then we're going to ban imports from you. Trade war, tragedy, that sort of thing. Quotas is a restriction on the number of imports. It can be corrupted because you can sort of have people smuggling in more of a certain good or service. So essentially a quota, say CDs, because I've got some CDs here, you might say we're only going to import 30 CDs from Japan, 20 CDs from China, 50 CDs from Australia, that sort of thing. It's to make sure that the market doesn't get flooded with CDs from all these different countries. so your CD still have a chance of surviving and thriving, and your CD industry can stay strong, and you won't lose loads of jobs, that sort of thing. Administrative restrictions are essentially safety measures which make exporting to a country difficult. So I think there's one country that says your headlights have to be on at all times or something. So it's extra work for any other person to have this sort of system in place to have the headlights to work all the time. So they think, well, no, we're not going to bother exporting to that country, and that keeps your industry safe within that country. So administrative restrictions are essentially anything that make the production of a good or service more difficult, so people think, can't be bothered, won't export to you. Voluntary export restraints, often shortened to VER, because lazy people can't be bothered to write the 3 words out. Okay, this is essentially when we've got 2 countries and one government persuades the other government to pressurise their exporters to limit supply in a market. So say we're talking about the hamburger market, we might have got country A whose government is telling country B, look, don't allow your producers to sell any more than 50 hamburgers to our country, to country A. And this restricts supply in the market, which leads to less competition and higher prices, and everyone's happier that way. Except possibly the producers in the original country who are producing their hamburgers, because they might think, oh, that's not fair, we could have sold way more hamburgers to country A than we were allowed to. I'm actually kind of hungry now, which is good, because we've reached the end of the video, so I'm going to go and have some food and set this to produce and upload itself, that sort of thing. Hope this video has helped and that you weren't too distracted by my tangents. Have a lovely evening and see you next time for the balance of payments. Goodbye.